listening to Trending with Timmerie, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics. National speaker Timmerie Millington has been a passionate advocate for life as long as she can remember, helping Gen X through Z answer the call to true feminism and authentic manhood. Timmerie holds a master's degree in biblical theology, and she covers this week's hottest stories from a Catholic worldview. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
Let's see, what are we talking about today with Father Tim Grumbach, Associate Marriage and Family Therapist. My brain's looking at the computer screen.
Sometimes I feel like it.
Oh, you are. This is the role of a pastor sometimes, right? So he's an associate pastor at St. Augustine Parish in Los Angeles. See, this is why my multitasking, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, I've got to get to the doctor later today. So they're like, you have to fast for like 8 hours. So I'm like, oh, I'm good at fasting. No, I'm hungry and some words will come out of my mouth and hopefully the right ones.
In other words, Father Tim's looking at me and he's like, okay, you just said the wrong thing. I'm the one who's fasting here.
We're off to the best start ever.
And you know what the great part is? I'm going to tease you for a second. He's like, yeah, I've got to fast for 8 hours today before my doctor's appointment. So I woke up extra early so I could get a meal in. Isn't that, though, how religious fasting goes? We're like, oh, yeah, it's Ash Wednesday. And then we fast until midnight and are terrible and like have In-N-Out at 1 a.m.
And then some people ask me about the Eucharistic fast. It's like, no, it's an hour before communion. So if you just had like a donut before Mass, I'll just preach for like 20 or 30 minutes and you'll be good by the time communion comes along.
Thanks for letting me know. Yeah, I'll just preach longer. So hour and a half Mass, no big deal. Well, we have a lot to talk about today. We have a priest, not a marriage and family therapist. If you heard my slip earlier in the show, thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking about things such as Duolingo. Who's learning a new language on their phone? Hey, this is awesome. What are you learning?
Oh, I'm learning Latin and French.
Awesome. I was learning Italian a few years ago. Totally forgot about it. And now I'm learning Latin and it's coming really slow, but it's happening. We're going to be talking about this crossover into transgenderism, Star Wars, cartoons for kids. We will be talking about so many important issues, but at the end of the show, you don't want to miss this. We will be talking about what chastity is. There's much more to be said for a married person, for a priest, religious, for a single person. So you don't want to miss this episode with Father Tim Grumbach. I want to start today, Father Tim. You sent over an article that really piqued your interest coming from Europe.
Mm-hmm, that's right. We're looking at how the biblical worldview is apparently incompatible with human dignity. And so this article that we're looking at is there's a Christian man who actually lost his job because he refused to use the preferred pronouns of some of the people that he was working with. And so this compelled speech, and now having lost his job, and it's really incredible because my understanding, of course, is that England has very different free speech laws, but that this still cost him his job, that it wasn't a matter of even of refusing to use certain pronouns. It was a matter of actually not using them.
Right. And this is what's fascinating. This was actually a medical doctor. And I'm sorry, if I had a doctor and I was confused about how I identified, you better bet that I would still want my doctor to treat my body according to reality, because if he didn't, he could just make up whatever procedure he wanted. I mean, if I'm not a female individual who needs to have her body parts treated as such, then why even have medical care if I'm not going to be treated that way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is where the truth of the matter comes in. And as Father Tim said, he was denied the ability to refer to someone as their biological sex. It claims that this is incompatible with human dignity, and in fact claims that it conflicts with the rights of others.
The tribunal's ruling actually explicitly mentioned Genesis 1:27. Male and female, God created them. And that they actually are looking at a religious belief that is something is actually in Scripture and saying it's incompatible with human dignity. It blows my mind. This is 1984's doublespeak coming to life, is that where you have to say one thing and believe another at the same time. This isn't just cognitive dissonance. They said that you're allowed to have free speech, just not in this case.
Well, this is what's fascinating. For the English, this is the first time in their history that a citizen in in England, my words are off today, but that a citizen in England is forced to engage in compelled speech. They're telling you how you have to speak. And this is a scandal of being forced to do something that we have been beginning to face here in various states in the United States, and now they're facing there in England.
Yeah. What's most troubling to me in this case is that it is claiming it is against human dignity to refer to Genesis 1:27, 1:26 and 1:27. It's, God's desire to create mankind in his image. The very concept of human dignity comes from those two verses.
Exactly. Okay. Oh, they're using our language.
Yeah.
This is what's interesting, because to be honest, like 10 years ago, if someone were to say the word human dignity, we must respect human dignity. I used to train people in public relations work and media work. And when I'd hear someone going up to do a secular interview talking about human dignity, I said, don't use the word. Talk about the value of the person. Use words that are relatable, because you say human dignity, you're talking in church speech, it used to be, and a word that people really don't understand what it holds behind it.
And what it holds behind it is, just even looking at the Hebrew from that scripture verse. Well, they refer to 1:27. It begins at 1:26 is the creation of mankind, where God's desire is to create humankind, male and female. He created them in his image. It's, Batsalmenu it comes from in our image. And it can be said that it's the image of a god being placed into his temple. It was a tradition of these ancient Near East religions to have the image of their gods placed in their temples as protectors, and in a sense to gather together the praises of the people and to lift it up to that God. And so God is placing us, not as idols, but as his image, into the Garden of Eden, where we're supposed to, in our human dignity, in our ability to worship God as male and as female, to gather the praises of creation and lift it up to God, and then bring the love of God down to creation and share it. The imago Dei, a little bit of Latin there for you, the image of God, is what gives us human dignity. So this is demonic to say that the very foundation of our understanding of imago Dei, of the image of God, the person created in the image and likeness of God, which has done so much for humanity. Without the concept of the Christian imago Dei, without that understanding, the world would be immersed even more so in slavery and depression and war if it weren't for the Christian image of the human person.
That's Father Tim Grumbach. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. I mean, this value that we have based on the dignity of the human person is what has compelled Christianity to start the hospitals of the world, to start the educational systems of the world. This is what compelled the Catholic Church to make sure that women were free to consent in marriage and weren't being forced into marriages. And this is where the human person has this foundation and dignity, because to be dignified means to have intellect, to be able to come to know something, and to have free will to freely choose it. And that with our dignity, yes, we are called to this great worship and glory of God. And so this reversal of language that's being placed on us, it's ironic, because if you look at the verbiage and some of the statements coming out of the employment tribunal there in England, they're saying that Christianity is protected, but being male and female is not. The two go hand in hand, and essentially they're saying that reality is not protected, because what is male and what is female is true. It's not only written into the basic reproductive anatomy, but it's even written into every cell of the human body, whether you're male or female, and how your muscles and your body engages.
Yeah, praise God for the great gift of the theology of the body that John Paul II spent his life for. Not just as a matter of teaching, but by the end of his life, it was a living example of the dignity of the human person, especially at the end of life. And to watch him, waste away, to watch his body waste away, but to know that there was still this great intellect, but even greater spirit that was there, and that he wasn't going to step aside. Some could say that our church is struggling a little bit because of the power vacuum that was created, in a sense, when John Paul II lost a lot of his physical ability. But I think one could almost say that it was worth it to see the example of living out that dignity even at the end of life. So he showed us, taught us not just how to live, but showed us, in a sense, how to die as Christians as well. And one could say that the theology of the body was given into our hands as a gift 4 times such as these, so that we have the language to speak about the dignity of the human person, created male and female. And yes, so many people are going through difficult experiences, and we have to be able to walk with them, most certainly. But we also, we can take up, the cry of this doctor who said he couldn't use these pronouns in good conscience. He said it would be irresponsible for a doctor to accommodate or encourage a patient's impersonation of the opposite sex. Yeah. It's really hard language for some people to hear, I'm sure. But he gets at something very important, that it's an impersonation.
Right. And he says he's not able to practice medicine if he can't look at a human person as a male or female. It's intellectually wrong. And not only that, it's morally wrong as a medical professional. Mm-hmm. Another thing kind of tying to this whole issue in this era of confusion that we are in, there's this magazine that I think is predominantly online. I was sent one of the articles via Instagram of 2 quote-unquote men, Spencer and Kelly, but actually Spencer is a biological woman and Kelly is a biological man. Now, these 2, it's the claim that, 2 dads are having a baby. 2 dads are pregnant. That's not the truth. A woman and a man are pregnant. It's being featured in Mother Magazine. They've opened their life up to be followed through all 3 trimesters of their journey. And the story is really fascinating to see, the wounds and the terminology, the language they use throughout the articles, and how they're trying so hard to influence the world in Mother Magazine with this story. And they're like, just accept, these are other ways to do things. There's just other ways, and, just be respectful of this. And it's interesting, at the beginning of one of the articles, it says that Spencer, who is actually a woman, presented as 100% male ever since having a mastectomy. And I thought it was interesting because there are multiple times where Spencer's 100% male. I'm like, how do you just make some random statement when biologically we know that this is a woman having a child?
Well, the language of this article is again so weaponized. It's made to get certain points across. What really struck me, and I don't know if it was a typo or it's just a way of using the language that I haven't seen before, but Spencer described, himself,
it's really a woman,
as being read as a man.
Yeah. And
I'd never seen that before. I don't know if that's that the language is used that way often, but it got me thinking about, it's not about being seen. It's not about being experienced. It's about being read, almost like a book, so that you can write your own story. And now you're being read as a man, even though you're biologically a female. And so, again, I wasn't sure if that was a typo or if that was the language is being used in a very specific way. I don't know how the transgender community, if you will, if that's something typical of the language they use, is that, I'm going to be read this way. And so I was thinking, well, that's like a book. So you're writing your own story. And
your own interpretation.
Right. And so your body is just something that you can change at your will. As you write, as if you're writing a story. Scripturally, we know your body does not belong to yourself. You were ransomed at a great price.
Right. For the sake of helping you, the listener, so we'll refer to the woman and the man as such, even though they identify separately. We'll be referring to a biological reality. But the man ends up commenting about how when the person he thought was a man came up to him and was very chivalrous and was the most modern day type of chivalry that he had ever experienced. And here's what's interesting. Even though these people are saying, well, I identify as this, I identify as that, it's fascinating to me because within the transgender and gay community, there is still this ideal of masculinity. There's still this ideal of chivalry that they have ingrained in them, despite trying to say that they're fluid and they identify however they want. They hold to an ideal. So the man is trying to say that this woman had such a manly and chivalrous side to her when she kind of approached him to ask him out.
Yeah. Well, it's always been one of the great questions of the experience of a person who identifies as transgender is, how do they know for sure what it's like to be, if one is biologically a male? How do they know that they are experiencing life as a woman? Mm-hmm. How do they know what it's like to be a woman? They may have some, hints and clues from their experience of women in the culture, but to know in their most intimate part of who they are, oh, I must be a woman. How does one know that? It's an important question to ask. And the matter of language of whether or not we call them, hims or hers, he's or she's.
Are you confused yet?
Yeah. Well, and right now we also have to be very careful about the way that we use the language, because there are some in the church who will capitulate and say, yes, use the language they prefer, because for so long they've been called what they don't identify as. So let's accommodate them. And very loud voices in the church, very prominent voices who get to meet with the Pope, are saying it's important for us to use their language that they've chosen for themselves. Right. But as we just saw with the doctor in England, it may be more respectful not to use the language that they are impersonating. One could say. So
it could be harmful.
Yeah. So it's a difficult balance to meet pastorally.
One more little comment I just wanted to make about the story of these two people who are having a baby is that as they're kind of identifying, so the man identifies as queer, but the woman identifies as a man. And throughout the story, there are little tidbits where you hear them saying things like it was so hard to try and reject basically their biological femininity, or where the gentleman in the story ends up talking about in preparing a home for their child, how they're creating the home that they always wanted to live in, to be brought up in and get to live in, like these things that show there's this longing, this brokenness that's there that they want to try and fix in some way that they missed out on in their upbringing.
Yeah, I would be curious to hear a little bit more about their stories, to actually get to know them other than just these are the pictures that we've created the environment and we want you to see how lovely this experience is. And, I can say, looking at the pictures that they've kind of put this photographic journal together so that we, the reader of the article, can experience what they are experiencing in this gestational period. And just the language that they use. Let me get at that. Another couple of lines that really struck me was, it says that Spencer was still physiologically equipped to get pregnant. She's still a woman in a sense, but you can't say that. And Spencer, the gestational carrier, is a transgender male.
The gestational carrier, that's a new one.
Yeah, I don't know how that adds to the dignity of the human person to refer to somebody in such a robotic mechanic,
right.
Purely biological
reductionist
sense.
type of mentality.
I know. I understand that they're trying to present Spencer as a father, and so to say that Spencer is a mother because that's what she is, because she has a child in her womb,
and she's biologically a female.
She's biologically a female, but this give it all, this do or die. We need to use this language to get this point across, that they had to create these new terms that sound so lifeless. It sounds like an artificial womb to speak of somebody as a gestational carrier. And how does that protect the human dignity of a person?
Well, and isn't it interesting because Dr. Lana Wen, who was the president of Planned Parenthood, resigned. And one of the things that we've come to understand that she pushed back against the rest of the organization with is she refused to refer to quote unquote pregnant person. She still wanted to stay a biologically male or female correctly. And I think there's a testament to the good she saw there, and truth is truth with regard to medical care. And that is a very important. For those who are just joining us, that's Father Tim Grumbach, and you're listening to Trending with Timmerie. I want to talk about just the scandal and confusion that's being said. So on one side, we could talk about the story in Mother magazine that no big deal, two dudes are having a kid and look at this, isn't it great? And it's just an alternative lifestyle. But in reality, that's not the truth. It's a woman and a man. And in reality, when you live a actively gay or transgender lifestyle, and I'm talking about sexually active in various ways, which usually include multiple partners, engaging in types of sexual intimacy that are not for how the body is created to engage, you have high level risks of STDs, HIV and AIDS, hepatitis, cancer, prostate cancer, testicular cancer, colon cancer, HPV leading to anal cancer. You guys, I could go through the list. Michael Gasparo and I were talking about 10 things that people who identify with certain types of alternative lifestyles, as some people say, should talk about with their medical care professionals. This is a big deal. And so to just showcase a story so blasely on Instagram or Twitter or in a magazine, you are leading others into a very harmful lifestyle that you're not talking about those elements. And this is the same thing with this new story about Disney right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're looking at the way that even Disney itself will be teaching our young people about the experience of sexuality just by the kinds of characters, friendships, relationships that they've created. We're especially looking at one of the Star Wars cartoons.
Yes.
What's the name of the show?
Star Wars Resistance.
Star Wars Resistance.
Yeah, they're confirming that Orca and Felix, or Flix, I think I might be saying it wrong, that these two are indeed a item, which are two males, apparently.
Yes, and that they're proud of their two characters who are a gay couple.
Why? For kids.
Yeah.
Is this necessary? Same thing with the show Arthur. So many of us grew up on Arthur.
Oh, right.
Why?
Yeah. Well, it's... one may be virtue signaling. The other may be that they understand the power of their show to teach and to educate. And perhaps our parents have given over their primary responsibility as educators, maybe because of feeling unfit for the role, maybe misunderstanding that that is their role and what it consists of. That the call it the government, call it the entertainment industries, other groups are coming in to present themselves as the primary educators of our young people, and it will happen, on our Saturday morning cartoons now. Well, it has been. It has been for as long as there have been Saturday morning cartoons. They've been teaching our young people.
Well, and it's allowed for adult content to enter into children's shows, children's educational systems. I mean, it's absolutely unacceptable. And it's interesting because I was reading part of the article about the Star Wars Resistance characters on Disney, and someone was commenting about how, well, they're just a bunch of, space creatures, and this one's really just a blob, and this one's this. Like, they're not really people. So since we're in space, anything goes. Since they're not human, anything goes. Well, something stood out to me about that, and it's this. If there's no value and dignity to the human person, if there's nothing to speak of with regard to our maleness as male and femaleness as female, if our reproductive systems don't matter, if human life can be wasted away through abortion, if all of it doesn't matter, well, then have at it and have fun. There's no meaning to anything.
Yeah, I was really saddened by that sentiment actually coming from Donald Glover, who played Lando Calrissian in the Solo, the Star Wars movie that came out, was it last year, I think. And the question he asks is, how can you not be pansexual in space, right? You've got robots, you've got blobs, you've got, whatever. And it's this ridiculous, dare I say, idiotic sentiment that once I leave Earth and I leave this life, this world, this life that I know it, and I go out there, the moral standards that I have here don't apply out there. And so I can become a moral standard of my own. And so why should I even think about holding the standards of here on Earth? And so, which is really sad because, the Star Wars story, the mythology of Star Wars at its core from the beginning was about this battle between good and evil. And so there was a morality. And so now it's becoming, you have these characters who are trying to blur the lines and create their own morality. And that's happening in the cartoons, but it's also happening in just these interviews with the stars of the movies who say, well, yeah, if I was this person, not just acting as this person, but if I was him, I would be out doing this and doing that, and I would be a morality to myself. And that has been the fall from the very beginning of humanity.
Well, isn't it interesting? Because as you see the most recent Star Wars movies as well, with the resistance, right, you've seen this lack of clarity in their mission, a lack of who they're actually fighting against, a lack of purpose. My brother and I will go around and around talking about this, and there's this kind of idea that they don't really know what they're fighting for, and that's the problem. A real good story shows that there is a good side and there is a bad side, and that good always must conquer over evil, and even if the characters struggle along the way, that is the truth of the story.
And I've always thought that, yes, real life is a little more complicated than this person is bad and I am good and I have to fight and defeat that person. But we still need stories that tell us there is such thing as good, there is such thing as evil, and the promise that good will be victorious over evil in the end, because that's the truth, the proclamation of the gospel, and that gets lost in a lot of modern storytelling, which seeks to be edgy by making it so gray.
Timmerie will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmerie. That's Timmerie. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
A thank you to Solidarity HealthShare, who is a supporter here of Trending. Solidarity HealthShare is simple. They help their members pay for affordable and quality health care by enabling the community to share in each other's eligible medical expenses. So you can choose your doctor who you want to see. Even integrative and alternative medical treatments are eligible for sharing. And Solidarity is the only healthcare ministry that allows for coverage of NaPro Technology for fertility, infertility, and costs associated with natural family planning. So you can learn more about Solidarity HealthShare at solidarityhealthshare.org. Father Tim Grumbach is in studio with me, and we've been having fun learning some languages on Duolingo over the years. And in fact, Duolingo has become really prominent within the high school and middle school educational systems as well, because it's so well put together. You can learn Italian, you can learn French, and in fact, they've even offered what they claimed years ago was a language they would never offer, a dead language called Latin.
Ooh, a dead language. Shall we get into that? No, it's a beautiful and sacred language which protects and keeps safe the sacred things of our Catholic faith, and yet they've found ways to distort it. We're looking at the way that, yes, Duolingo teaches our young people, and we were just saying how Saturday morning cartoons used to take that role away from our parents and whatnot. But we're looking at the way that the gender ideology has even found its way into the lessons that are being taught in Duolingo, and
lessons, apps, you name it, it's everywhere.
Yeah, and aside from the ideology itself, the app is great because it taps into all the addictive things that video games and these other apps and social media uses, the bright colors for the notifications. So your brain is getting a little bit of
even the sounds.
Yes, even the sounds. So that when you've succeeded, you get this little dopamine rush. And I've noticed I want to go back to this and keep learning, even though I'm tired, even though, maybe I'm done for the day, I've done too much, but, I want that tiny little bit of a dopamine rush that I can get from having succeeded in properly conjugating and using the proper declensions in Latin and whatnot. And
that's probably why I failed in part at staying consistent with learning Latin, because I have my phone on black and white, as do you. Mm-hmm. And then also I don't have the sounds on, so it's very anticlimactic. My husband will be sitting there, he's like, come on, turn the noise on. I'm like, no, your noise is getting in the way of my pronunciation, okay?
Yeah. Oh, well, you have a husband. You can have a husband, because that's interesting, because this picture I've just pulled up on my phone, because it was one of the lessons for Latin. It's the correct answer was maritus maritum habet, which is the husband has a husband. And the very next lesson, the Latin was femina uxorem habet, the woman has a wife.
So in other words, Duolingo is trying to teach everyone, not just children, but anyone using this app, that male on male and female is totally game. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem that is being ingrained everywhere.
Yeah. Well, there's almost a tremendous irony here, because these are the Latin lessons, right?
Right.
Who in the world is learning Latin that's not Catholic, right? Through Duolingo.
Right.
Okay, so maybe there are some out there, but at least in the social media circles that I run in, the people who want to learn Latin are the people who want to become more familiar so as to appreciate and dive more deeply into the tradition of the church. And so while not everyone is on Latin, studying Latin on Duolingo, I'm also learning French. And very early on in the lessons, there's this very cute picture of a man named Daniel holding the hand of a man named Pedro. And the correct answer is ils sont mariés. They are married, in the masculine. And there was a later one, I didn't get a picture of it, but I was so tired of this stuff by the time we got around to it. But it shows Daniel and Pedro again, but they've got 5 kids surrounding them. And it's like...
it don't work that way,
man. Yeah. So it's like that they have 5 children. I'm not sure how they got this. I mean,
Okay, so here's a comment on that last area. People, especially young people, I'm talking high school going into college and even a little later, are sometimes somewhat ignorant of the biological reality of how children really do work. And I'm afraid that with the rewriting of medical textbooks, the rewriting of an ideology taught in the schools, that people are going to be really surprised when they find I can't have children. Mm-hmm. Not only because they're taking hormonal contraceptives and things that are causing permanent, at times permanent or long-term infertility, but that the ideology of marriage and love is not fruitful in the way that the culture is presenting it, it doesn't lead to the option where two men can have 5 children biologically.
Right.
And even if they do have 5 children that are not their biological children, that's going to come with a lot of challenges in the upbringing of those children, both in terms of what they need and also in terms of what these two quote-unquote partners are giving and receiving from each other.
And as we were talking about earlier on the last episode, was this contraceptive mentality, and that's being built into this new ideology of sexuality. Is that not only in this gender ideology where, on Duolingo, a husband can have a husband and a woman can have a wife, and Daniel and Pedro are married. I need to be careful. I don't want to be mocking the people who this is their experience in life. I want to be mocking the language and the way that they're trying to teach it through these language courses. But that
I'm laughing at the confusion.
Right,
that's what's ridiculous.
Yeah. I'm not going to be reading in any of my liturgical books that the husband has a husband, right? That's the reason I'm learning Latin. But that while we're kind of laughing at the ridiculousness of this being taught through this, color exploding app that is meant to keep your attention, we're also worried about this contraceptive mentality in the culture where there may actually be teenagers, you're saying, who don't understand how the biology of sexuality works, but they're also being taught that sex is not meant for procreation. And there are some, I imagine probably even there are some doctors out there who are saying, no, the reason for sex is not children, it's for pleasure. Yeah. They'll even say it's even to unite a couple. But that's why the church for centuries taught as the primary end to married life was the bearing and rearing and education of children. Yeah,
marriage wasn't just for the sex and the love in and of itself, but it was oriented always from its inception toward having children.
Yeah, and the language in the church's modern magisterium has somewhat softened the language and brought the idea of the marriage covenant, of the union between husband and wife, to the forefront as almost the primary ends of marriage. But JP2 in his Theology of the Body, while he really led it in that direction, he was very clear that you can't speak of union between husband and wife without also speaking about the procreative ends to marriage. So we have a culture that is seeing that husband and husband can have 5 children, but they're also seeing that the reason for sex is not to have children. It's this tremendously conflicting ideology that's being fed now through our Saturday morning cartoons and through Duolingo.
You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. That's Father Tim Grumbach. And one comment I wanted to make there is that the church hasn't actually downplayed that the primary end is having children and more so bringing them up in the faith and truth. But what GP2 did, as you're saying here, I just want to emphasize it because it's so important. He elevated saying, let's not reduce marital intimacy of the spouses. What the spouses has is so good, and it is uniting, and it's for the good of the community. It is to help sanctify one another, because there was this movement for so long that kind of downplayed the marital embrace between husband and wife and that relationship they had, that he said, no, this has great value. And we need to recognize this in a culture that is devaluing sexuality, and also recognize that life that comes from it is what brings even greater fruit in relationships.
Yeah, and his great work, Love and Responsibility, that he wrote as Karol Wojtyła before he became Pope, but it became more widely known as he was John Paul II. He pointed out that we are not the same as the beasts. We are not the same as animals. We have some of the similar drives. It was a very important language for him, was these drives and these instincts that lead towards procreation. But we as humans have a certain ability to love, and with that comes the responsibility to know that our sexuality is more than our biology, more than something biological. And unfortunately, even for the sake of pleasure, our young people are being taught that sexuality is a matter of pleasure, and even that pleasure is merely, dopamine in your brain or whatever it might be, all these pleasure chemicals in your brain. And so the reason why you want sex is not to have children. The reason you want sex is to have pleasure, and you were biologically made that way, and you don't need to understand yourself any further than that. And your identity is about your attractions and what can bring you pleasure, rather than God has given you the power and the authority and the responsibility to bring new life into the world, and not just into the world, but into eternal life.
Mm-hmm. Father, I want to transition gears a little bit here and talk for a minute about the movie The Joker, because I know you went to see it, kind of warnings and thoughts, and really you said something that really stood out to you about the movie.
Right, and we've been talking about the dignity of the human person, and you can almost see it in the reverse in a movie like this. Is the Joker has always been it's almost like you like to hate him. It's one of our favorite great supervillains in all of comic book history, probably one of the greatest. And yet this gives a very different take on it. I won't give any spoilers to the movie other than to say that the emphasis is not on this maniacal supervillain who is evil right down to the core, but it's a movie about mental illness. And as I was saying earlier today, this reality that people break people and leave them on the streets. And it's the story of somebody fighting back and finding a fulfillment, finding the attention that they never got in this violence. And so people have been really concerned about this movie, that it was going to cause violence. It was going to give a very real image of how to handle one's mental illness by lashing back out. And I don't know if that's happening, but it's so disturbing and so dark a movie because it seems so real. And it's, that could be the guy who's living on the street, outside my house, outside my church, wherever it is. And so the reality of it is so dark that it really concerns me that there's a generation of people taking this stuff in and this entertainment who don't have a method of prayer to bring that brokenness before God.
You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
A few more thoughts on the movie The Joker. Father Tim Grumbach is with me in studio, and he had thoughts. He was talking about how there's a problem when, whether it's a Joker or any other show or maybe place we're stuck in, or even looking at the culture right now, when we're stuck in this darkness or the depression, the mental illness that permeates in so much of what we're exposed to. What happens if we just sit in that and don't have the necessary faithful things?
Yeah, as soon as the movie ended, I wanted to stand up and yell, now what are we going to do with this? I don't know anyone else's heart in that full movie theater, but I knew that I was going to walk back to my parish, which is only a few blocks away from the movie theater. I was going to kneel down before the tabernacle and say, Jesus, this is what I just saw, and I need healing because of how dark it was. I don't know if anyone else was going to be doing that. So I wonder if there are a couple of different responses that these people who've taken in this entertainment, who've taken in this story and this darkness, how are they going to handle that? Yeah. And I wonder if one of them is what the media seems more concerned about happening, is somebody lashing out in the same way that you get these copycat Joker killers out on the streets, almost like the clowns that were wandering around in the forests in the South, a couple years ago, and everyone was afraid of these killer clowns, and that was so weird.
That is creepy.
So one concern is these imitating what one sees in the art. What concerns me even more, though, is that people not even acknowledging what they just saw, and it builds up in them that there's this darkness that they've just taken in, and they can laugh it off. Some of the, I remember seeing John Wick 3 and some of these other really violent movies, and some of the most uncomfortably violent moments, some of the most graphic violence. The theater would be full of laughter, but it's not like that was hilarious. It was just a very nervous laughter, and I heard some of that while watching Joker. And it really concerned me that, I could go home and I have the Blessed Sacrament before me, and I'm going to spend some time there and unwind and let Jesus have it. But how is anyone else in that theater going to deal with what they just saw?
And I think it's a challenge to us, whether we're talking about, Arthur, we're talking about the Star Wars Resistance cartoon, we're talking about the Joker. We're at a point in time where it's hard to consume media today without being overly influenced emotionally, mentally. And we could go on scandalized even, or, we also pay with our eyeballs. So what we're giving our support to, it's time to remember that we are called to holiness, and to be holy is to be set apart. And so what are you doing to refrain from certain activities or certain shows for the sake of your holiness, for the sake of your salvation here and now, and for the sake of others?
Yeah. And that was a question that people were asking me when I mentioned this on the Twitter, was that I just saw Joker, and I'm going home to pray, but I don't know about all these other people, how they're going to handle that. You know? And people were asking me, like, why would you even go see that? Or, it's so dark. Why would you let that into your life? And that's a good question. Still trying to answer it. I started reading Stephen King when I was in 5th grade. And so I've been, close to and near these stories most of my life. And I do recognize the way that it impacts me spiritually, but I know that I can bring it to prayer. And I know that, so I'm still trying to discover why I'm so drawn to these stories, but how do we handle it since we're consuming it? Do we let it consume us? Do we let it shape the way that we relate to other people? Do I learn to distrust the people who are experiencing homelessness on the street now because there's this story of a mentally ill man who becomes Joker? How does it affect the people right in front of me? And I don't think people are asking that question about entertainment because they say, oh, it's just a movie. And so that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's just a movie. I don't have to worry about the way it's affecting me. I'm saying I recognize the way it's affecting me. And I'm going to keep on watching these things for the time being, but it's also shaping the way that I pray. It's helping me to meet the people that are in front of me without seeing them as just, as nothing, but seeing what could happen to them.
Well, I think that it's an important message of discernment as well. You and I were talking earlier in the last show about discernment, and some people just don't do anything and other people jump in too soon. And, there's this balance, but are we actually taking the time to discern and think through our motives? Okay, there's a follow-up in a movie series I really want to see, or there's this book, or maybe there's this person I want to hang out with, but are we asking the question, is this good for my soul? Yeah. And it may not be an outright obvious evil, but I think that we need to take on that responsibility, like you're saying, Father Tim, of really questioning our own motives at times and then acting upon them. Yeah, and being honest about it and willing to ask the difficult questions of what media, what entertainment brings up in us. A couple nights after seeing Joker, I went and saw Ad Astra. And, I definitely won't spoil that one because I enjoyed it. I thought it asked some important questions, and, it wasn't a perfect movie, but one of the major questions throughout it, as in most space travel movies, is, are we alone? And, I won't give you the answer that the movie gives, but, whether or not we're alone or not, people will just approach it from a scientific standpoint and say, there must be something out there, without asking the question of, okay, what if there is nothing else out there but us? What does that put us in relationship? How does that put us into relationship with God, with the Creator? Are you willing to ask those questions? Because either way, if there's intelligent life out there or not, if there's not, it's a terrifying thing that we are alone in this universe. But our faith tells us that that we have God, that no matter how big the universe and how insignificant we may seem, that makes God's love even greater for us. But then if we are not alone, what does that say about God's creative ability? The questions, they stop asking the questions when they start getting really good, and that's the concern with movies like this. With Joker, with Ad Astra, two very different movies, very different stories. I'm afraid our society, and again, I don't want to just lump it in with culture or society, but the individuals. People stop asking the questions when they get good. Well, we even start asking the questions when we achieve that next level of something we've been working toward, and then we just kind of sit in it and maybe forget what our purpose is, forget the morality, forget, the code of ethics that we had. Father Tim Grumbach is here with us for Trending with the Timmerie. I want to change gears here and talk about chastity for a minute. I often get a lot of questions surrounding chastity, marital chastity, and so forth. Let's dive in a little bit. One of my favorite parts of the Catechism of the Catholic Church is actually the long section on chastity. And especially where it points us in the direction of understanding not just chastity, but the whole of Christian life and asceticism. It talks about how self-mastery is, I'm going to quote, long and exacting work. Father Tim and I were talking about this earlier, and it goes on to talk about how, in fact, it assumes that we are working on this through all stages of our life. And it talks later on about how even when we're younger, it requires more intense and a rigorous improvement and care and development. And so when we're talking about chastity, chastity relates to all the other virtues in the Christian faith. And it's a lifelong journey, whether you're married, whether you're single, whether you're a religious. You have to battle against the ways of the world, against the longings of the body to live that virtue of chastity.
Yeah, it becomes this lifelong mutual gift. Beautiful language it uses here. It says that chastity is the school of the gift of self, which is important because school doesn't last like a day or two. You've got chastity figured out, and then it's easy the rest of the way out. There's no graduation from chastity.
Right.
You know, some people might think, oh, once I get married, my sexuality will be all figured out, and I'll never be lonely again, and I can have sex whenever I want. And ask any married couple, that's not how it works. But rather, chastity, like you said, it's long and exacting work. And it's a lifelong school of the gift of self.
And it talks about how, in fact, the place that chastity blossoms is within friendship. And I love that statement because we struggle with friendship today.
Yeah.
Friendships are so hard. Yet that is where we learn chastity, that giving of self, that self-control, that love of the other person for the sake of the other person rather than our own pleasure and desires. That's where chastity begins. And we begin to see that chastity, as you were talking about earlier today when we were working on the shows, it's a yes. Chastity is being faithful to your vocation, whether you're single, married, religious, whatever it is, and conforming all of your sexual desires, your thoughts, everything into that life.
Yes, and it requires grace. It's not something we can do by ourselves. But take courage by this. If you hear us speaking about chastity and that word frightens you, and because you know where you've fallen and you know how difficult it is, especially to try and do it by yourself, hear these words of the Catechism, that it is, it's a long and exacting work, but it also is, it has laws of growth, which process through stages marked by imperfection and too often by sin. It's a matter of growth. And so if you're falling in chastity, that's a part of the growth in chastity. So take courage, but be vigilant. Be patient with yourself, but also be very vigilant about what leads to your falling, and knowing that you have to learn how to fall in order to grow in chastity. It doesn't mean that God wants you to fall in chastity. It doesn't mean that he wants you to sin. But if God couldn't use that fall and couldn't use that sin to help you grow in chastity, that sin would be greater than God. And we know it's not. Yeah.
That's an important point. And I think that it's also at the same time as sometimes being more gentle on yourself is what you're saying, Father Tim. If you're not changing, if you're not getting out of the rut and the monotony of the unchaste lifestyle you're in, whether it's a porn addiction, it's, overexposure to certain types of media or to certain people, it's a sign that we're not growing. And it's a sign that we need to do something to allow that growth to begin to occur, both by A, allowing it, and B, seeking it.
And being sought by it. Let's use that language as well. It's a grace that God will put into our lives that we know we can't do this by ourselves. And it's a charism. Chastity is a charism that you need to get only from the Holy Spirit. And it requires tremendous self-effort, yes. But we know that it's not something done by ourselves. And it being a charism for the church, it's not for you. It's for the good of the church, to build us up. It's an example and a much-needed witness of the faithful in the world today.
Remember that chastity is faithfulness to your vocation now. Not what you want it to be tomorrow. It's faithfulness to your vocation now.
This has been Trending with Timmerie. To book her to speak or learn more about her guests, visit radiotrending.com. You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes.